Hey guys, welcome to Boxing Squared for boxing news and views from around the internet. Joseph Parker has tasted defeat for the first time in his career, losing a unanimous decision and his WBO belt to Anthony Joshua in Cardiff, Wales. And now that his O has gone, he's got to pick himself up, dust himself off and plot the next move of his career. And with that in mind, it's worth teasing out a few of what I believe are the possible next scenarios. But first I'll touch on the post-fight press conference comments from Team Parker, because there's a few indications of what's possibly to come. In respect of the fight, so Parker echoed his in-ring comments that the better and big man won, and that sentiment was echoed by his trainer Kevin Barry and promoter David Higgins of Duco Events. And when questioned about the lack of punches thrown in the later rounds, Parker, he admitted he should have done more, but he just ended up being a bit wary, and he will learn from that mistake, from all of his mistakes from this fight. And Kevin Barry, he was complimentary of Joshua's performance, saying AJ had tightened up on a number of areas that they'd looked to exploit. Parker, Barry and Higgins all expressed a degree of frustration over the Italian referee's decision to break up any inside action, but they were careful not to be pulled into a certain line of questioning of blaming the ref for the loss. I thought that they walked the line pretty well and were quite gracious in defeat overall, although I do note there's a few media, New Zealand media in particular, that are trying to run the blame the ref line, even though Team Parker were quite careful to try stay away from that. And while Parker expressed his desire to get back in the ring as soon as possible, Higgins, he was clear that Parker and the entire team that supports him will now be having a well-earned break, and that when Parker is ready, they'll sit down, discuss the next move. And when pressed on what that actually might be, what it might look like, the promoter, he discussed future options could lay with the likes of Eddie Hearn's fighters, Dillian Whyte and Derek Chisora. They were named. Or potentially an American-based fight could be next, and that would be with Bob Arum. He wants to make use of the co-promotional arrangements that Duco do have in place with Top Rank. But interestingly though, there was no mention of Lucas Browne, and I'll come back to that in a moment. So in terms of Parker's performance against Joshua, he does come out with some credit. He gets some more respect in general. A lot of fans didn't think that Parker had a chance of going 12 rounds with Anthony Joshua. No one else had ever done it. And a lot of people were saying he wouldn't last more than a few. I mean, sure, it wasn't a sparkling performance from either Joshua or Parker, but Parker's become the first guy to go 12 rounds. He's one of the few guys to take rounds off Anthony Joshua, and that shouldn't be dismissed. As Higgins put it, Joseph Parker is still a commodity. His profile is much greater now, and the next option, it will depend on a couple of things. What makes the most sense? He even quoted Don King saying, what makes the most dollars makes sense. So let's look at those options, starting with Eddie Hearn's Matchroom. The names mentioned, Dillian Whyte and Derek Chisora. And in respect of Whyte, it's a pretty good fight, but is it realistic? Whyte is seemingly on track for his own title shot, and will he want to face one of the best in the division with Parker? Because if you look at that fight, what is there to gain for Joseph Parker? Parker went 12 with Joshua, something Whyte couldn't do. And it's sort of similar to my thoughts on Dillian Whyte facing Luis Ortiz. I don't see that fight happening or getting made unless it's ordered. I mean, what is the upside for Dillian Whyte in facing Joseph Parker other than money? And from what we saw in the Joshua undercard, Dillian Whyte wants to face Alexander Povetkin potentially in June. He called him out at ringside. It's unclear if Povetkin wants to take that risk given he's in pole position in the WBA and WBO. But then again, Whyte is atop the WBC rankings. So there potentially may be some mutual interest if the money is right. They're atop 3 of the 4 sanctioning bodies. So there is something there for Dillian Whyte to gain. But Joseph Parker, no doubt he will soon enter the rankings again, but he's not necessarily guaranteed a quick route back to a title shot. It's realistically probably going to take 18 months to 2 years minimum, perhaps faster if he signs with Matchroom or even Al Heyman. Before I get to Derek Chisora, it is worth noting Parker only has 6 months left on his 6-year promotional deal with Duco. There hasn't been actually much said on the likelihood that he re-ups with them or not come November. It's certainly possible, but now he's back to square one, or maybe square two. Can Duco secure the fights that Parker needs to get back in the conversation for a title shot? There's an argument to be had that the smart career move would be signing with Matchroom, which now controls 3 of the 4 belts through Anthony Joshua, or signing on with advisor Al Heyman, who is the power broker behind PBC and advisor to Deontay Wilder. I'm sure Parker, he will be having some conversations with his personal management team, which is different from Duco. His personal management team involves some of his family and a retired High Court judge, or maybe it's Supreme Court judge. It's Bill Wilson anyway. So he'll be talking to them about these very issues in the coming months, because he needs to look at his future and where that future may lie. And the other related issue, and this is something that comes up all the time after a Joseph Parker performance, does Joseph Parker need a new trainer? Should he part ways with Kevin Barry? It's an interesting question. It's a good question. I think there is some scope for some fresh thinking in Joseph Parker's camp. But as I see it, I don't necessarily think Parker leaves Barry. The bond between them is too deep. It's so deep, it's almost like father and son. So I could potentially see him changing promoters, but not necessarily trainers. But I think, there is some room for some fresh thinking for Joseph Parker. He needs to make some improvements. Maybe Kevin Barry isn't the guy to help him get to that next level. It's worth, it's an interesting discussion point. But in terms of that next fight, someone like a Derek Chisora, that's actually not a bad option. Chisora, he's been in a raft of competitive fights in his career, and while he's come off second best in virtually all of them, he's still a face, he's got a following, and he's not so shop-worn that it would be a ridiculous suggestion. I mean, Parker, he'd be the clear favourite, obviously, but it's not a bad option for his comeback fight, coming off that loss. But Chisora, no doubt he'd be wanting a decent payday to fight Joseph Parker. He's a mercenary sort of fighter after all. But I could see them potentially making that sort of fight in New Zealand, where Parker is a big star. There potentially would be a decent payday for Derek Chisora. Or potentially, it could feature as a chief support type of fight on an Anthony Joshua or even a Dillian Whyte card. We'll have to see on that front. Okay, so the American possibilities. That essentially means Top Rank's Bob Arum, he wants to likely match Parker with either Bryant Jennings or Andy Ruiz Jr. I'm not sure how much interest there would be for a Ruiz Jr. rematch, but the Jennings option, it could have some legs, I could see that. Jennings is on the way back after 18 months out, and he's got decent pedigree. But in terms of generating a lot of money, I'm not really sure it would actually do that, because Jennings, he's virtually been invisible for a couple of years. He's only fought a couple of journeymen since coming back from his hiatus, and essentially he's got no real media or social media presence. I mean, to be fair, he's on social media, but he's not using it to drive his profile. In terms of some other options, I'm sure Bob Arum potentially has some other names that he wants in the mix, and there are some other names that I'm sure Duco might be able to tee up for Parker to face. But I do think they potentially might have to bring their expectations down on the money front. And before the Joshua fight was made, you may remember, they were looking around, they were trying to use the belt as leverage and say, look, we're looking for a good payday here, but no one would stump up enough money. So potentially Duco, now that Parker has lost the leverage of the belt, they may just have to bring their expectations down. And to be honest, a number of guys are going to avoid Joseph Parker because, let's face it, he's just a little bit too dangerous for some guys. What is the actual benefit now of fighting him? If you're a contender on the way up, what is the return for you? What is the benefit? I mean, having Joseph Parker on your record is one thing, but at the moment, is it helping them? I really hope we don't see a return to Parker knocking over dreadful journeymen and the fans and the public being sold as these things as good fights, good events, because most of them were not. There was no value there. It was sort of thinly veiled, and we were sold by David Higgins in particular saying, you're funding Joseph Parker's journey. Well, the journey's over now. It's starting from scratch. They can't have that level of opposition and try to sell that to fans now. I mean, I think there would be a lot of fans who would just refuse to pay $30, $40, $50 to see Joseph Parker knock over a journeyman. I don't want to see that. And I know some will say, well, what about reviving the deal to fight Lucas Brown? They had one in place before the Anthony Joshua deal was signed. But I question, how much interest will there be in that fight now after Brown was so thoroughly poleaxed by Dillian Whyte? It's not the fact that he got knocked out, and it was a brutal knockout. It's more the fact that he was terrible before it happened. And while it may be a fight that generates decent cash, the Trans-Tasman element and whatnot, both coming off a loss, I would consider it a mismatch now. Parker would likely blow Brown out in similar fashion to what Whyte did. And I think the New Zealand media and public, they're a bit more clued up these days on what a good challenge is for Joseph Parker. So a Brown fight may not cut it anymore with the fans. Nor, as I mentioned before, would blowing over well-trodden journeymen. There would be very little sympathy, I think. And I think Team Parker would find that those fights probably wouldn't sell as well as they did in the past because people have had enough of that. But there is a real risk, in my view, that the Luis Ortiz factor comes into play here. And what do I mean by that? Well, Luis Ortiz, dangerous guy, much avoided. There's just too much risk in facing him. And that could happen with Joseph Parker. And while Parker and his team, they're game for good matchups, he could be avoided. He could be avoided like the plague and potentially forced into those journeyman-type opponents to blow away a couple of stiffs and just wait until he secures a mandatory position. It's not a scenario that I want for Joseph Parker, and I'm sure fans don't either, but it could well happen. And that takes me back to his promotional arrangements. Parker, he may have to make a difficult decision at the end of this year for the betterment of his career. And that's not to take anything away from what Duco have done, because they've done a great job overall. But the question now is, are they best placed to rebuild Joseph Parker? The jury is out on that one, in my view, as is Parker's training setup. And Parker, at 26, he still has a good future in the heavyweight division. He has to be managed well, and he could be champion again. But plotting that course back, it may not always be plain sailing. And I am expecting a few headwinds and a few bumps along the way. What about you? What do you make of it all? Drop a comment loud and often. Hit like, hit subscribe. Follow me on Twitter, boxing_squared. I'm out.